What's going on, guys? As you can tell from the video title, today we are going to be installing a audio system on this 2014 RXPX 260 with the T3 hull. Now, if you have this ski or if you have a generation from around here or this body style with the T3, I believe it was the same from 2012 to 2019, something like that, you're kind of familiar with the fact that there is no real good option for audio, I should say. Aside from doing your glove box bracket or doing a full custom setup. And that's where I'm going to show you this video today. Today we are going to be using the Soundwaves PWC Audio Super Freq pods. These are full enclosures that we're going to use. This is the 8-inch variant, so we're going to be installing 8-inch speakers, which I'll go into more detail about. But I just wanted to show you this because this is one of the rare instances where there is finally some support for audio on this body style. It's been one of the most requested things. I did do a video on a audio install on a ski that did not have factory audio options available. And that's where we installed speakers inside the fiberglass, which is a good alternative. But of course, a lot of people want to know, is there any way that you can do a pod style enclosure setup? Because they just don't want to drill into the fiberglass, understandably, and that's where these guys will come into place. Now, this is a very, very beefy enclosure. I don't know how much this weighs, but it is a good 15, 20 pounds, I would say. It is some very heavy material. And if you look on it, on the bottom here, this is a very well-designed unit. A lot of the problems that people face when doing aftermarket audio is that they're not actually taking sound engineering into the equation, and they just basically have a pod with a speaker in it, and then they wonder why it doesn't sound great. This is one of those actual enclosures that does take sound engineering into the equation, and you can tell everything from the acoustic layout to you have your ventilation here. That's, if you know anything about sound design, your frequency response and everything, that's kind of what plays in there. And this company does have your standard 6-inch. They have a couple different models supported. I'll show you the website in a second, but for this model we went with the 8-inch so we can get some nice big speakers in. And you can see here we are going to be using the Scar Audio SK 8Ms. These are some massive marine rated speakers. RMS on these guys is 125 watts, peak is 250. So I'll show you the amplifier we're going to be using, but these are some very heavy gauge, very heavy speakers. I mean, you can see the coil on this thing is just massive. This speaker alone feels like it's almost 5 pounds. But we'll get back to this shortly. I'm going to do the full install for you guys, from the enclosure install to the amplifier wiring to the speaker install. Basically everything that you need to know from scratch, with nothing going on the ski at all, just so you guys have a option available to watch if you want to do this yourself. First things first, let's go to the website. I'm going to show you some more details on this enclosure. Here we go. So I'll of course post a link in the description as usual, but these are the exact enclosures that we are going to be installing today. And you can see this is compatible with the 2012 to 2017 GTI, the GTR, the RXP, RXPX, and also the 2020 RXPX. Now you may be wondering, well, they are different skis, so how is that going to fit? It really comes down to this pocket here. Let me move this so you guys can see how things fit in this space here. If you have a GTI prior to the 2020 refresh, you know that this is pretty much the exact same layout on your ski. It also works with the RXPX, of course, which is what we're going to be installing today. So back to the website here. They actually recommend a few different speakers. The 8-inch JL, Rockford Fosgate, Scar. We're going to be installing the Scar today. Realistically, you can install any speaker that you wish. Generally, obviously, it's recommended to install marine rated, but if you're just going to have a display ski, it doesn't really matter. 8-inch may be overkill for a lot of people. In my case, we want a decent amount of audio capability, so 8-inch is the ones we're going to be going with. But if you're curious, they do have all of they actually have plenty of supported models, including the skis that do have factory audio, like the 2020 Plus, which is standard for pretty much all SeaDoos. But they do have upgradability, 2 speaker capability, and of course there's Yamaha support as well. So let's go ahead and get into more details on the ski. For the amplifier, you can of course pretty much use anything you wish. In this case, we're going to be using the Boss MC900B, which is a marine rated amplifier. Some have good experience with Boss, some don't. It really depends. There's higher quality amplifiers like the JL MX280, which is pretty much the standard go-to for all SeaDoos. I was going to go with that, but got a great deal on this Boss. If it doesn't end up working out, we'll swap it out. No big deal. But this is the unit we're going to be going with. So I'm going to walk you through pretty much everything we need to know, including how we're going to mount our control unit, the wiring for the speakers, the wiring for the power. We also have a remote wire, which is our blue. If you watched my last few videos on amplified installs, you know that the blue remote wire, or your control signal, is basically what triggers the amplifier to turn on or off. On a factory audio system ski, that trigger is by the start button. So whenever you hit the start button on your ski, it'll send power to the amplifier to tell it to wake up. Obviously, if you're on a aftermarket setup, there is no interface between the stock electrical system and your amplifier, so you have to be able to trigger the amplifier to turn on somehow. And there's a few ways you can do that. I'm going to show you how we are going to do that. But this is the amplifier we are going to go with. The first thing we need to do before we even get to the enclosure mounting is to figure out where we are going to be installing this amplifier. There's a few different places you can put it. In the last amplified setup, I actually installed it on the side of the fiberglass, just in this area here. I may end up doing that, or I may just end up installing it on our plastic in the front storage bin here. Not quite sure yet. There's pros and cons to both. Obviously, if you mount it on the fiberglass, it's kind of out of the way. The downside with mounting it on the plastic is that this is your storage bin, so it can get pretty banged up if you have like anchors and things like that in here. We'll go through the pros and cons. I just kind of want to do a breakdown of everything we're going to be doing here. So this will be a pretty involved setup. Generally, if you were doing this for the first time, I would set aside 4 or 5 hours, which includes the enclosure mounting, the amplifier mounting, the wiring, the speaker install, all that stuff. If you've done this a few times before, this is something you could probably knock out in about an hour and a half, 2 hours. So we'll see how this goes today. But first things first, I'm going to go ahead and figure out where we want to install the amplifier in here. Just taking in note that we have to account for the wire harness and things like that as well. So we have our RCA connections, which are built into the amplifier. And then we have a separate, I forget how many pins this is, 16 pin. This, you know, it's a marine rated amplifier, but of course the wire harness is not. We'll do our best to make this water resistant, but it's just one of the things you have to consider. So I may not go with the bottom, storing it on the plastic. That's the easiest for serviceability. I may still end up doing it, not sure. I'm going to aim for doing a fiberglass mount. The only downside with mounting it on the fiberglass is if you ever have to service it or remove it, it's kind of a pain to get to. So I'm just going to brainstorm here for a few minutes, and then I'll show you what I come up with. All right, so I decided that I'm going to go ahead and mount it on the side of the fiberglass. I'm going to do it on this side here. This is going to be my wife's ski, so I want it to be pretty much as seamless as possible. I don't want her to have to worry about the amplifier being in the storage basin and her dropping something on it, or, you know, wet towel or whatever, and it destroys it. So I'm going to try to keep it in a low maintenance area, and I think behind this pillar, our trim here is going to be the best spot. We'll keep it on the inside, but in order to get there for drilling holes and mounting and everything, we have to remove our plastic pillar here. On this ski, it's very simple. We just have it depends on your ski. You may just have a plastic push pin. On this one, it's a T30 bolt. So we have a T30, and then there is a 8mm on the back of the plastic here that it's holding in. And then this whole piece will just slide right off. Now that we have the trim off, we have easy access to right here. The amplifier is going to mount on the other side of this. We just need access here to be able to thread on the nut and bolt. So all we need to do now is take our amplifier. I'm going to hold it to basically the spot that I want it on the inside. We'll find a nice flat spot for it. Mark the holes with a Sharpie, and then we'll go ahead and drill them out. And then I'm just going to use a stainless nut and bolt to keep it in place. And in case you're wondering, this is the set that I'm going to be using for the stainless hardware. This was just a kit that I picked up on Amazon. Every time I do some audio upgrades, this comes in handy, or really just any kind of aftermarket editions in general. We have various sizes and stuff like that, so I'll link this in the description as well. Pretty cheap, but works out great for things like this. All right, I have the amplifier mounted. As you can see, we have it hanging right there. Now these wires, the RCA, we are not going to be using these, so we could just leave those capped. We have a USB feed in here as well, but we're not going to be using any of those. The only thing we're going to be using is the 16-pin harness, which is still out here. Otherwise, if this was attached, I would recommend waiting to do the amplifier install until you have your wiring finished, just because it's going to be kind of a pain to do this with everything in the hall. But for us, it doesn't matter. We can do the wiring outside and then put it in. So the next thing we're going to do is prepare, kind of figure out where we want to put our control unit and the switch. I'll explain the switch in a second, but let me just try to figure out where I want to mount this, and then I'll explain the next steps. All right, so here's what I came up with for our control system. It's going to be up here. Now, there's going to be two parts to this. If you remember at the beginning of the video, I mentioned a switch, a 12-volt switch. I'm going to explain this part next. The first thing I want to bring up is our controller. Now, there's a couple different places you can put this. One is, you can surface mount this specific one. You can see it pops out here. So you can surface mount it, or if you look on the side, we have these indented tabs. So if you were to cut out a square for this or a rectangle, you can kind of snap it into place to make it a flush mount. You can also choose to install it on a surface level, basically on top of this lid, or you can store it inside somewhere so that you can, it's basically flush right there. So I've been thinking about this for a few minutes, and I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to mount this on our top storage bin here, flush mount it. That way, when my wife is riding, she can easily change her music right here without needing to lift the lid to access the controls. Also, you get your volume control here as well, plus your play pause. So if we're riding and come to a stop, it's just going to be easier for her to be able to hit the buttons on the top here without needing to open this every single time. So that's what I'm going to do there. I'll show you how we're going to get a perfect square cutout. The next thing is our 12-volt switch. Now, if you remember from what I said earlier, when you have a aftermarket amplified setup, you need to be able to tell the amplifier how to turn on and turn off. Now, some amplifiers will let you tie your 12-volt, here we go, the remote connection. Let's see if that's even the one. Some of these, I'll have to try to find on here. But you can bridge your power and your remote turn on together and then just use the on-off on your remote console, just like this guy here. This is your, if you see we have a power button there. Hold this to turn it on, hold it to turn it off. However, some amplifiers will not let you do that, and you need to have your 12-volt signal trigger the amplifier to turn on and turn off. Otherwise, the amplifier is just going to sit on basically 24/7, and if you don't use your ski for a few days or a few weeks, you're going to come back to a completely dead battery. So what you can do is every amplifier has your, here we have our wire harness, pretty much every single one, every audio system I've worked on in the past 15 years or so, the remote wire is almost always blue. And this blue, well, that's the out. I'll have to find the one that's for the trigger. That will just need to go to some kind of 12-volt power supply that turns on whenever the ski turns on. Now, there's a couple ways you can do that. You can tie into your fuse box, find a fuse that triggers on whenever the ski is on, and then you can use like an add a fuse or a tap a fuse. In my case, I am going to put it on a separate switch here, and this is going to have power. Coming from the battery, I'll put a fuse on here, obviously. But this way, when the ski is off, everything is off, there's no key, there's nothing. If my wife wants to listen to music, as long as this switch is on, she'll be able to play audio. And of course, when she's finished, she could just shut it off this way. Now, that operates quite differently from the factory SeaDoo audio that you would find on something like this model here, where you know the only way you're going to be able to play audio is if you have your key in and your screen is on, or the ski engine is running. When you take your key out, your music's going to shut off in about 10 to 15 seconds or so, whatever it is. That's basically what that remote trigger wire is. Of course, on this amplifier, they use red, just after I said for the past 15 years or so, I've only really seen blue. However, this one, as you can see, they mark it as ignition. This specific amplifier, it's not universal across the board. You can tie your constant power and ignition together and just rely on using your shutoff on your amplifier controller, this guy here. The only problem is, you know, if you come back to the dock and you bring the ski up or whatever, you forget to turn off your sound system, it will drain the battery. This amplifier does have a low voltage shutoff, so after the battery gets down to a certain voltage, it will shut itself off. The only downside is, unless you shut it off, it's always going to be draining the battery. So whenever you come back the next time, if you're not using the ski for a day or two, a week, whatever, it's always going to have a dead battery. So just to play it safe, I'm going to put a switch on this wire here, and we'll just run with it that way. All right, so now that we have a basis of where everything is going to go, we have our control interface with our power switch, the amplifier is mounted where we need it to be. I think the next step is to go ahead and mount our enclosures. That way we can get into doing the wiring, which is, you know, that's always the slow drawn out process. Once we get the enclosures in, it's really going to start to feel like we're making some progress. Now on the Soundwaves Super Freq pods, it's actually very easy to install. There's actually only 2 bolts that are really holding everything together. So I'm going to go ahead and get that out and I'll show you what we need to do. Pretty simple with 2 basic hand tools. So if we look at the bottom of the enclosure, you're going to see we have a hole here and there's a hole here. This is going to be our bottom bolt. It's going to go through the fiberglass here, and then our side bolt is going to go through the fiberglass here. And this side bolt is actually special because this is where our speaker wire is going to pass through. So if you notice, this is the hardware we are going to be using. This here is for our side bolt. This is our bottom bolt. So we are going to drill into the fiberglass and insert this stud. So this is going to go, I forget where it is, somewhere in this spot. We're going to thread this in. And then our enclosure bolt is going to thread into this bolt that we insert into the fiberglass. The side mount bolt, this is special because if you notice, it is hollow. This is where our speaker wire is going to pass through the body. So once we install this, we tighten it down, our speaker wire is going to pass through the enclosure, through the body, and then go inside the hole where we can tap into our amplifier. So I'm going to go ahead and get the enclosure basically put into the spot that we want it. That way I can mark off the holes on where we need to drill, and then we'll move on to the next step. All right, so I held the enclosure to where it's going to go, used a small pick and a mark basically just to line up where our holes are going to go. You'll see one of the holes is right there. The other hole is right there. So the first one we are going to focus on is this one here, which is our bottom hole. This is going to be a 3/8 hole, and that's going to be just large enough to house our bottom bolt that this is going to hold into. You can see we have a threaded insert inside there. So 3/8 for this guy. I'm going to go ahead and drill that. I'm just going to use a small drill bit first to get it basically just drill out a pilot, and then we'll move up to the 3/8 to get it installed. Now that we have our bottom hole drilled, we can go ahead and take our bottom mounting point. We're going to start that in there, and then we're just going to take a 8mm Allen key and thread that in. You want to take your time with this. Do not rush it. Same thing with the drilling. You do not want to speed run this. Fiberglass, you know, take your time with it, because if you drill too hard, the gel coat will flake off. So just take this nice and slow. I'm going to go ahead and get this in, and then we'll move on to drilling our next hole. All right, so we are ready to install the enclosure. You see we have our bottom threaded bolt here, and then we have our opening for the speaker wire hole. So you can see here, these are the bolts I'm going to use. We have this is the Allen key style with our fender washer. This is going to be our bottom bolt. Remember guys, this can only go in one way, so it's very hard to screw up. This is going to go in just here, but it's going to go through the enclosure, obviously. So we'll put that's going to be our bottom bolt. We have our hollow bolt here. This is going to go in from the inside out, so it's going to pass through our opening here. And then on the inside of the enclosure, we'll obviously have our nut, spring washer, and our fender washer to keep everything tight and down. So only 2 bolts needed to hold this enclosure into place. I'm going to go ahead and get the enclosure installed. I'll tighten down both bolts. We'll show you what it looks like, and then we'll go ahead and move on to the other side. Check it out, guys. We have the first enclosure mounted, and it is rock solid on there. Perfect install. And you can see we have very easy access to our through fitting to send our speaker wire through. Nice solid face here. So I'm going to go ahead and knock out the other side. I'm going to do that off camera just because it's the exact same process. And then once we're finished with the enclosures, we'll go ahead and move on to the next step, which of course is wiring. All right, both enclosures are mounted, and you can start to see this thing start to take form. They are some massive, massive enclosures. So we are good to go with the hardware mounting side. Next step is to go ahead and get on with the wiring section. I think what I'm going to do first is actually get started with mounting our remote control, our interface for the amplifier. Try to get in focus there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to mark out a template on our lid here. I'm actually going to detach this, just pull it off. And then what I'm going to do is basically grind around with a grinding wheel, a small one like a hobbyist wheel, to get this as a perfect square as I can. That way it'll snap into place here. Once that's done, we can go ahead and send the wire through and bring it up to the amplifier. But I'm going to get this done first just because, you know, once we get this in place, the rest of it should be pretty straightforward. For any of you that are looking to do the same thing I'm doing, I basically just drew a template out with a Sharpie, marking the bottom side here. I'm going to go ahead and use my Dremel with a grinding wheel and basically just do a kind of precision cut along the side there. If you want the easier way, it's really just going to be installed inside here, or realistically just use your surface mount. You just need 2 screws here and just sit it on top of your box. I'm trying to go for a cleaner look, which of course is also the harder way. So the only problem with trying to get it flush mount, you'll see, is that we have these tabs and you have to be pretty precise with your cuts. The other downside is that you'll notice this is curved, so it's not going to be perfectly flat, but I'm hoping I can get it somewhat close. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this out. I'll see what I can come up with. All right, there we go, guys. It's not perfect. You can see there is a slight overhang on the side there towards the middle of the glove box, but I had to do that just because the edge is too close to where the foam is, and if I brought it any closer, it was just going to lap there, and then the lid wouldn't be able to shut. So just a tiny bit of overhang there, not a big deal. So I'm going to go ahead and get this reattached, and then we'll move on and we'll start to get this guy installed. That way we can control the amplifier. One thing I want to note about this switch is that it's not a 3-way, even though there's 3 prongs. A lot of people get confused by switches like this. If you ground this switch, you actually get a status indicator power LED. I'm not going to do that. So if you look at the load thing on the back here, I'm only going to be using the bottom pin and the center pin, which will turn the system on and off. I'm not too concerned about the LED on there. So we're going to ignore that top pin where you can see on that diagram it says earth. That would connect to your negative on the battery. I don't really care about that. So we're going to put the battery positive on the bottom pin, and then the signal wire, aka the accessory or the ignition on our amplifier, is going to go onto our middle. For this, like I said, I'm going to mount it in the glove box. I'm most likely going to kind of drill a hole here or on the back side, and then I'll mount this inside the glove box. That way it's kind of out of the way. This doesn't really need to be accessible from the outside, so we'll put it inside the glove box. This one's a little bit easier because it's round, so we just need to drill a round hole, put this through the glove box, put our plastic nut on, and then we can go ahead and feed the wires. But I'm going to do the wiring after this. I just want to get this guy mounted. All right, so I have the glove box lid on, and you can see we also have our on-off switch here. You can put that switch anywhere. I just put it in the middle here just so it's easier to access. Now what I'm going to do is send the wire for this. I'm probably also going to make a quick loom for our power switch. I'll show you that though. So I'm going to send this through. I'm going to drill a small hole in the side of our glove box towards the top, just so we can send that through the side. And then there's a few different ways you can do this. You can drill a hole through the fiberglass. You can send it through to the front. I'm going to send it right through our factory air inlet. I'm sure you saw when we had our plastic fairing off here, there is a 3 or 4 inch hole that we can send our wire through. Actually, you can kind of see it. Let me turn our light on here. Our factory inlets, I'm going to send the wiring through that guy just so it's cleaner. We don't have to drill too much fiberglass. Plus it's right there. It's not going to affect anything. So I'm going to send this wire through that. This needs to go up towards our amplifier. We have a ton of extra, so I'll just be able to loop this up, but we'll have our connection. This 2.5 or 3 point, whatever this headphone jack looking thing is, that's for the actual control. And then our orange one here, this is for illumination. Doesn't really matter. I'm still going to connect it anyway, but obviously we can't ride PWCs at night here in the United States, or at least in Pennsylvania. So that part doesn't matter. But anyway, I'm going to go ahead and send this through to the front, and then I'll show you what we're going to do for our wire loom or our wire connections for the on-off switch. All right, so the first order of wiring is going to be our switch. This is our ignition switch. Now, if you look at the wiring diagram on here, this just mentions to connect it to an ACC power, basically anything that lights up whenever you connect or when you press the start button or put the key on, really anything like that. In our case, we're not going to be doing that. Of course, we're going to be putting it on a switch to the battery. You'll notice here it doesn't mention anything about a fuse because it's assuming whatever circuit you tie into with add a fuse or whatever is already going to be fused. In our case, we don't have a fuse since we're basically tying directly into the battery. So we are going to be using a inline fuse like this. You know, there's no real risk with the switch because it's going into an amplifier that will be fused. The problem is that we are going to be having a power wire come off the battery, go around the chassis, and it goes into a switch right here. If something happens with that switch, or if this wire gets pinched or whatever, you know, it's a direct line to the battery. You can send a lot of power to it. So we always want to have fused connections, anything that's coming off of the positive terminal on the battery. And that's what we're going to be doing with this guy here. It does not need to be anything major. This is basically just a signal circuit, so it's going to be less than 1 amp. So we can use a very small gauge wire for this. You can see here, these are some very small wires. These wires here, I purchased a long time ago. They already have the connectors on them. If you do not have the connectors, they're pretty basic spade connectors. So I'm going to use this. I have a spool of some wire, and of course I have my wire hide. So all we are going to be doing is we're sending 2 wires through. One's going to be positive, one's going to be negative. Doesn't really matter the polarity. All that matters is that the positive is coming out. It's going to the input of the switch, and then the output of the switch is going down to our red wire on the amplifier. Turn the switch on, tells the amplifier to turn on. It is not giving power to the amplifier. All it's doing is telling it, I want you to turn on. The power side, which is the yellow connection on this amplifier, we'll get to that later. This is just going to be the signal to turn it on. Now, to make things easier for me, I'm just going to use this existing spool, which has the red and black together. Now, generally, it's not a good idea to use a black wire on a hot wire or a hot circuit, just because, you know, that may give you the indication that this is a negative wire, even though it's not. So I'll probably put some red tape on here, but essentially we are going to have the red, which is going to come off. I'm going to send this through the hole. So we're going to have one end of this on the inside where the battery is. The other end is going to come out and it's going to go to the switch here. The red is going to be what's coming from the battery to the switch, and then the black is what's going to go back into the battery area, and it's going to connect to our ignition sensing on the amplifier. To connect our wires, I'm going to go ahead and use our marine rated shrink connectors. These are pretty cool because there's no crimps. You basically send the wires into each end and then you just heat it up. That is solder in the middle, so once it gets hot, the plastic will obviously shrink, the solder melts, and then you have a soldered waterproof connection. And there we go, 2 waterproof, nice, solid, reliable connections. So I forgot, instead of using the plastic wire loom, I'm actually going to use the wire tape. I use this in previous audio installs. I like this stuff a little bit more because it's easier to work with. Plus, it just looks cleaner and more OEM. So I'm going to go ahead and loop this around the wire. first thing I want to do is kind of figure out how much I need. So I'll get the connections here and then kind of run it alongside the ski to about here just to figure out what length of wire we need to run. That way I'm not going to wasting an entire spool. All right, so before we move on to the next step in wiring, which is really just going to be everything at the amplifier, I think it's time we finally get the speakers in place. But in order to do that, of course, we're also going to need to wire in the speakers. So what I'm going to do is basically just build the harness for this. We'll send wire through. Again, we have our through hole fittings that our speaker wire will pass through. We'll drop the wire at the front, so we'll do that for both speakers. That way we can at least get the speakers in place. We'll get them bolted in, and then we'll deal with the wiring last. But I wanted to show you this here. So I took the mounting bolts for the speakers out of the pods. Of course, the enclosures do come with these, just so we can kind of test fit our speaker. And you can just see just how massive these speakers are. It's just not going to sit in there, but how much more massive those speakers are compared to the factory SeaDoo ones that you can see down there. Of course, I also have aftermarket speakers on my ski, but still these enclosures are huge compared to the factory ones. So I'm going to go ahead and we'll stage the wiring, and I'll show you how we're going to make the wire harnesses for our speakers. All right, so the speakers aren't going to be too bad at all because you can see they are pre-labeled. We have positive and negative. I'm also going to be using the pre-made connections for the speakers as well. So positive will be red, negative will be black. We don't need to worry about the color coding and everything until we get to the amplifier wiring, but we're going to do that last. So essentially, all we need to do is take a positive to our positive, negative to the negative. I'm going to extend it with our speaker wire here, and was going to send a bunch up to the front. So let's go ahead, we'll knock out one speaker. I'll show you what the wire pool looks like, and then we'll knock out the other one. All right, here's just a small update. I have a crimped together wire, or I should say soldered together with those solder connections. And then I have our OE wire tape. So this is good to go. I measured it, it's about 3-4 feet, which is just enough for the left speaker to mount on the pod, feed through, and send inside. So I'm gonna see if I can just put the speaker here and show you what it looks like to send the wire through, and we'll get it mounted. All right, so we'll go ahead and send our wire through. Plenty of room, and it's already through. So I'll put the speaker on, and then we'll pull the extra through on the other side, and that's it. Check that out. We are getting closer to being done. I'm gonna go ahead and knock out our right side speaker, and then all we have left to do is tie all the wire together in the front. So let me knock that out, and then we'll continue on. All right, it is finally time to do some wiring. This is the part that everybody always gets confused about. So I'll try to go into a little bit more detail here, but I promise you it is not that hard. So I'm gonna first explain what the wiring diagram shows here and some precautions and things we'll need to know about. So like I said earlier, this whole left-hand side, we can pretty much just ignore that. We are not using any of the RCAs. The instructions for this one say that we need to tie into a ground point, not the negative post on the battery, but if there is no ground post, you can tie into the negative on the battery, so that's what we are going to do. Bluetooth antenna, that is the pink wire. We are not going to be using that. We don't have an antenna or anything. We have our yellow cable. That's this guy here. That's going to be our positive for the battery. You can see there's a fuse there. We have our ignition red. That's what this guy is here. Again, that is the wire that we are going to tie into the switch that we installed, which is going to tell the amplifier when to turn on. We have our remote out. Generally, on most amplifiers, the blue remote wire is what tells the amplifier to turn on. In this case, Boss has it set so that the remote out is triggering other amplifiers to turn on if you have multiple amplifiers. In this case, we do not, so we are going to ignore the blue wire. And then, of course, we have our 4 outputs. This is a 4-channel output amplifier. We are only going to be using 2 channels because we obviously only have 2 speakers. So we just have to pick whichever set here that we want to use, and we can ignore the others. Some amplifiers can be bridged. If you purchase an amplifier that says it supports bridging, basically what that means is you are going to combine 2 channels to make one powerful output. That way, instead of a 4-channel, you'll have a 2-channel. In this case, this amplifier does not support that. So say, for example, we'll pick this white, white, black, and then gray, gray, black, and then we're going to ignore the green and violet. That way we only have to worry about these connections. We'll have our red connection, our yellow connection, and of course our black. We have our control panel connection, but those are self-explanatory. They only go in one way. Now, obviously, this is going to be in a marine environment, so you don't want to have any unused wires just sitting exposed. So I would recommend using something like this, which is what I'm going to use, which is liquid tape, and it's a pretty solid waterproof connection. So say, for example, we are not going to be using the green and violet, these connections here. So you can see that they always leave these kind of pre-snipped for you. I'm just going to cut them flat, dip them in liquid tape, let it dry. That way we never have to worry about that connection getting exposed to water and getting damaged or whatever. So I'm going to go ahead and basically liquid tape all the connections we're not going to be using, and then we'll move on to connecting the speakers and the power connections. Now, the other thing I want to mention, and this may be applicable for some of you, maybe not. When you are connecting your speaker connections, generally it's advisable to use spade connectors like this. That way, if you need to disconnect the amplifier to take it out and service, you can. In my case, I'm not too concerned about it. I'm going to use the same connections that I use for everything else, these guys here, because they are absolutely waterproof. It's one less thing I need to worry about corroding. So I'm going to use these for the speakers. But first things first, let's go ahead and take care of the unused wires that we're not going to need. All right, guys, so all of the wire is soldered in. I know it looks like a mess. The next step is for me to just kind of clean things up here, wire tie some stuff off, zip tie, whatever, just to get it cleaned up. And then literally all we need to do is connect the positive to the positive, negative to negative on the battery, and we are all set. So I'm going to go ahead and get this cleaned up. I'll show you what the afterwards looks like, and then we'll give it a test. All right, just finished up tiring in the wires. So let's go ahead and turn it on. We'll see if this thing boots up. Switch. All right, we have a blue light. I just heard a chime. I'm gonna bring my wife out. We'll pair to her phone, and we'll see how this music works. All right, guys, here it is. This is some royalty-free on YouTube. Wife's phone is connected. Let's just see, we'll bump it up, see what we can do here. And that's significantly louder than the factory audio on a newer SeaDoo that you see over there. So that is some pretty loud speakers. All right, guys, and that's it. That is the Soundwaves Freq enclosures. Now, one of the things I want to point out that kind of separates these enclosures from a lot of the aftermarket ones you see are that these you can actually tune. And what I mean is you have these different inserts here, and you'll notice they are kind of, there's slots on the inside. Now, if you notice, the OEM SeaDoo speakers, I'm not sure if I'll be able to show you on here or not, all of the speakers have openings on the, yeah, you can't really see it on this. All of these speakers have openings on the bottom, which allow air to enter and exit the system. And without that, you kind of lack that low frequency, the bass response, which is unfortunate because that's kind of how a lot of the aftermarket enclosures are designed. They just don't have that air channel. The Soundwaves Freq do have that. Not only do they have it, but you can actually tune it for the speaker and amplifier that you have. For me, I just have the one that came with pre-installed, and that seems to be perfectly fine. We just did a sound test on it, and that's pretty insane. But you can tune these. I went with a pretty basic, cheap setup for my speakers. I forget how much the scars were. I'll put it in the description. The Boss amplifier. I have this one installed on a older GTR, and it's still holding up. Boss is kind of a low-end amplifier. If you want something better, I would recommend like a JL, especially the MX280, which is massively popular for jet skiers. In my case, this one's going to work perfectly fine. And even with the cheap Boss amplifier and go pair it up with the Scar amplifier or the Scar speakers, it is a pretty insane sound response. I don't know how well it comes up on the video. It's generally why I don't like to do sound tests on video, but they are substantially louder than the factory speakers on a SeaDoo, so that's pretty incredible. Nice, solid enclosures. These things are very rugged, so they're going to be awesome out on the water. If you are looking for enclosures for your ski, especially if it's a model that does not have a factory option, Soundwaves, cannot recommend them enough. This was a pretty straightforward install. The enclosures themselves only took, 10-15 minutes. Really just the wiring and the amplifier, speakers, and all that stuff. That's what kind of takes the time, but could not be happier. Looks nice and sleek, matches the body lines perfectly. Super easy install, and even for being 8 inches, which generally anytime I see 8-inch speakers on a jet ski, they seem oversized in my opinion. But the way these are designed, this looks fantastic. The benefit with the bigger speakers, of course, is the output. We'll get a lot more low frequency, so that kind of kick that you want from a sound system, this will have it. So that's it for this video. If you guys have any questions, feel free to leave a comment.